Hi everyone, and welcome to Critically Thinking Christian, where we talk about all kinds of subjects such as Christian culture, pop culture, and more. I'm your host, Alicia. Please note that my videos are primarily intended for a Christian audience. If you're not a Christian, that's fine. I'd love for you to stay and share your thoughts. But by and large, I am assuming that most of the people watching this are in fact Christians. Moreover, I want to make it clear that while I believe my opinions to be reasonable, and I try to base them on both biblical and historical truth, they are ultimately my opinions. If you find them helpful, great. If not, just forget about them. Let's go! Today's video centers around an age-old debate. Should Christians engage with secular media? Now, the word secular technically means anything that is not religious or spiritual at all. It's a fairly neutral term. However, it's easily mixed up with the term non-Christian, which could be anything that is not Christian but may or may not be religious. That term, of course, also gets mixed up with anti-Christian, meaning something that is actually targeting Christian beliefs and values. So for the purposes of this video, I want to be clear that when I say secular, I simply mean things that are not religious at all, not things pertaining to other organized religions or sects outside of Christianity, such as Buddhism, Hinduism, etc. Of course, media refers to all sorts of things, be it music, books, movies, TV shows, games, and so on. So again, our question is, should Christians allow themselves to be exposed to these things and interact with them? The short answer is, it depends. Now, I've come across plenty of believers who maintain that Christians should avoid listening to secular music or watching secular movies. The basic argument is, why should you engage in the values of the world? Why should you allow Satan a possible foothold in your life? That's a pretty reasonable premise, but it's one that I personally just can't get behind for 3 reasons. 1, this feed is virtually impassable unless you intend to become a nun or a hermit. Secular media is quite literally everywhere in this country, and you would have to have your head completely buried in the sand to not at least take note of it. Jesus specified that his disciples were in the world, but were not of the world. But to pull this off, you would basically have to be in your own world. And if you limit yourself to only Christian books, movies, and more, that's not a lot, and unfortunately, it tends to be lower in quality in general. There are some great works of Christian media out there, but they tend to be few and far between. Meanwhile, you would be cut off from many great works that are secular but still convey important truths and values. My second reason is that, as I said, you would have to cut yourself off from the rest of the world in order to avoid all forms of secular media. But this means that you would be cutting yourself off from unbelievers on a fairly massive scale. As St. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 5, verses 9 through 12, I wrote to you in a letter not to associate with sexually immoral people. I did not mean the immoral people of this world or the greedy and swindlers or idolaters. Otherwise, you would have to leave the world. But actually, I wrote you not to associate with anyone who claims to be a brother or sister and is sexually immoral or greedy, an idolater or verbally abusive, a drunkard, or a swindler. Do not even eat with such a person. Note what Paul says in verse 10, that we are not to avoid the people of the world, and that to do so would require leaving it. We are called to be witnesses, and some unbelievers cannot be approached in any other way except to engage with them in a common interest. Paul understood this quite well as he continues in 1 Corinthians 9, 20 through 22. To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win Jews. To those under the law, like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, to win those under the law. To those who are without the law, like one without the law, though I am not without God's law, but under the law of Christ, to win those without the law. To the weak I became weak, in order to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that I may by every possible means save some. Notice that Paul says he is willing to become all things to all people. Paul is, of course, always obligated to follow God's moral and spiritual law, but he is determined to meet everyone at his or her own level in order to witness for Christ. However, that would be extremely difficult for us to do if we stick our heads in the sand and ignore every facet of our culture that may be meaningful to unbelievers. The third reason is that every individual is different and we are commanded not to judge. Jesus says in Matthew 7, "Do not judge so that you won't be judged. For you will be judged by the same standard with which you judge others, and you will be measured by the same measure you use. Why do you look at the splinter in your brother's eye, but don't notice the beam of wood in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the splinter out of your eye,' and look, there's a beam of wood in your own eye? Hypocrite! First take the beam of wood out of your eye, and then you will see clearly to take the splinter out of your brother's eye." Thing is, I've met some Christians who were very restrictive about secular media, but had glaring spiritual problems of their own that caused a lot more damage to their families than secular media ever did. For instance, my best friend's parents were such strict fundamentalists that they had to pre-watch everything for her, as well as flipping through books she wanted to read, even when she was in high school. That utter lack of trust, coupled by their tendency to put too much work onto her, led her to become embittered towards Christianity. It's a sad reality, but there really is such a thing as being too careful. Moreover, in Romans 14, Paul declares that we are free from scruples when we give ourselves to Christ, and that we should not judge one another. Who are you to judge another's household servant? Before his own Lord he stands or falls, and he will stand because the Lord is able to make him stand. One person judges one day to be more important than another day. Someone else judges every day to be the same. Let each one be fully convinced in his own mind. Whoever observes the day, observes it for the honor of the Lord. Whoever eats, eats for the Lord, since he gives thanks to God. And whoever does not eat, it is for the Lord that he does not eat it, and he gives thanks to God. In other words, everyone has their own views on various matters, and everyone reacts differently to different things. But you should never assume that because you have a certain opinion about something, therefore everyone else should be obligated to share it. There are things that I know I need to avoid because I know they would have a detrimental effect on my mind, but that doesn't mean everyone else has to avoid the same things I do, and vice versa. The biggest takeaway here is that whether you decide to include secular media in your life or not, always use your God-given intelligence, never berate someone else for making a different choice than yours, and definitely do not attempt to mandate your decision on another person. If you are the type that needs to avoid secular media for the sake of your spiritual health, do not go about calling people who do include it as evil heathens or devil worshippers. And if you are the type who is able to deal freely with secular media, do not rub it in other people's faces or try to pressure another Christian to join you when he or she is unwilling. It's one thing to correct misinformation, it's another to behave as a bully. We should build each other up in love, not put each other down. As Paul tells us in Ephesians 4:29, no foul language should come from your mouth, but only what is good for building up someone in need, so that it gives grace to those who hear. Lastly, I want to say this. I am not a parent, and even if I were, it is not my place to tell other people how to raise their children. But while I may not have experience in parenting, I have witnessed the effects parents' decisions can have on their children. I mentioned my best friend earlier about how her parents' over-the-top strictness has embittered her. I've also seen the opposite, where parents have set their standards too low and exposed their children to adult content too early, desensitizing them. I've also seen people whose parents over-sheltered them so much that when they stepped into the real world, they were bombarded with new ideas and ideologies that they didn't know how to handle. It's an extremely difficult balancing act, knowing what or what not to share with your kids. All I can say is this. Make sure that, whatever decision you make, you talk to your children about why you are doing what you do. Kids aren't stupid. If you try to dismiss what they feel and think, I assure you they will not thank you for it. Well, that's a wrap. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section. And remember, my brothers and sisters, so whatever you eat or drink, or whatever you do, do everything for the glory of God. Thanks for watching. God bless.